Hello everyone, I'm very glad that you listened to my story. Please give me a follow and like the video if you enjoyed it. Feel free to comment and provide feedback so I can improve the sound quality. Yes, we invite you to listen to part 3 of the series. Chapter 34. The Dark King, Chapter 34. Invitation from the Nobles. According to the latest research by the alchemists, 2/3 of you who read that The Dark King still use the damned ad blocks. Whitelist. Anger was building up. Does he want to tell that I don't belong in here? Dudienne was getting to retaliate back when he thought of Peter's words and resisted the urge to retort, yes, Mr. Peter brought me over. Peter who? Middle-aged noble frowned, even the scavengers are here. Are there no rules? Mr. Mace. At this time, a voice resounded. Dudienne and middle-aged aristocrat looked together towards the root of the sound. It was actually the tough old man Dudienne had seen in the office. He was wearing a black gentleman's suit, besides him there was a middle-aged lady holding his arm. From their affectionate attitude it seemed that they were husband and wife. At this time, the old man saw Dudienne. Little guy. Why are you at the door? Didn't Peter come over with you? Mr. Peter has just entered, Dudienne said honestly. At this time, the middle-aged aristocrat named Mace frowned. Old Luo, do you know him? The old man laughed, yes. I met him today. This little guy is this term's seed object from scavengers. He will have to rely on Mr. Mace's care in the future. So it is. Mace seemed to understand, glanced at Dudienne. Little guy. You have vision as you have chosen our melon foundation. Dudienne's face was ugly, his fists were clenched tightly under the sleeve. Old man quickly said, little guy, quickly apologized to Mr. Mace because you stood in front of the door blocking the entrance and then joined the party as not to be left out. Then he winked at Dudienne, motioned him to go into the hall. Dudienne looked at old Luo's face for a moment. He knew that old Luo had come to his rescue. But also knew that as long as he didn't apologize, he would not be able to pass by Mace. At this moment, he realized that there is not right or wrong in this situation. It all depended on each other's identity and status. In this world, if the one with the power said that yogurt was black, then the weak one should confirm. The difference between the two sides was depending on the difference of the power held. He suddenly understood the truth, without power he was no one. I'm sorry, he bowed his head in an apology. Behind the alluring lights of the magnificent and melodious music, his face was hidden in the shadows. His eyes were focused on the other party's exquisite boots. Then he saw the boots move and turn towards the hall. The old man seemed to look at him, but did not say anything, but also followed. These civilians. It does not matter how good you teach, never learn the rules, Mace's voice echoed in Dudienne's ear and then the old man's laughter. Dudienne still held his head down, clutching his fists. After a long time he slightly rose his head. Looking at the front of the wide manor, he suddenly felt more freedom in the darkness. At this time, more carriages began to arrive. Dudienne quietly retracted his eyes, did not continue to look at the door and walked into the hall. The large and spacious hall was illuminated by oil lamps as if it was illuminated by daylight. Large number of servants brought wine and fruits in the hall. The melodious piano music came from the front of the hall. Nobles were standing in small groups chatting together. After the previous situation, Dudienne had no mood at the moment to enjoy this rare luxurious party. He walked to an open window and leaned against it. He was looking at the hall where people were moving. It was like a flowing picture scrolling in front of his eyes. He felt faint boredom until 2 black uniformed men appeared on his line of sight. They kind of interrupted his trance. Hunters. Dudienne immediately recognized the medal on 2 men's shoulders. There was a black falcon engraved on medals which identified them as hunters. They seemed to be very young, maximum 17 years old. As they walked, aristocrats took the initiative to greet them. Apparently they were well-known figures. Soon the 2 hunters came to the middle of the banquet, where a few middle-aged aristocrats stood. The man who Dudienne previously had apologized stood there. Besides him there was a fat lady and a slim middle-aged man. Dudienne could not hear what nobles chatted with those 2 hunters as they walked into the middle of banquet. According to their manners, their identity was high. Hunter, Dudienne's eyes flashed slightly, suddenly thought of Roseyard's alchemy notes. There was a record which had impressed him. It was about the anatomy of the hunter. After Roseyard had caused an incident, a young hunter was tasked to find and kill him. Roseyard had prepared potions to control the nervous system in advance and had caught the hunter. He had used knife to dissect the hunter into countless pieces of meat without anesthesia. Roseyard had found organs and bloods that were different to normal humans' body components within the hunter's body. He was inspired by his findings. It was one of the factors that led him to be certified as a 3-star alchemist. Hello, scavenger. Suddenly a shadow appeared from Dudien's left side. It was a white-haired old man with a kind face. He was using a walking stick. A large jade ring was on his thumb. However, the clothes that he wore were more simple in comparison to the others in the party. I assume you are the seed from this graduation, as you are able to attend the party. Am I right? White-haired old man smiled. Dudien nodded slightly, said, "You are." White-haired old man smiled and said, "I am Feline Ryan. Nice to meet you." Ryan. Dudien eyes moved. 3 years ago the desert where they were tested seemed to be the territory of Ryan family. Dudien's face noticed the weak changes. White-haired old man with smiles, "I assume you have heard of our Ryan family's background. But they are stories of the old. Are you interested in being Ryan family's knight?" Knight. Dudien was surprised. He had desperately studied in the library for 3 years to increase his understanding of this era. He had cleared up many things which were alien to him at first. The so-called knight is not only a simple title. For a normal person to acquire the title, he had to go through professional training and as well as a strict examination. I did not say clearly. White-haired old man continued, "Your name only will be linked to our family. We will provide you with the official knight's salary and you will need to help our Ryan family to explore the wilderness once a year." Dudien understood his purpose. "I can go for expedition with your family's scavengers without a contract too, can't I?" "Of course you can." White-haired old man laughed, "This is all private business. Moreover, you won't bear the costs of going and coming back from the giant wall. In fact, most of the noble families privately cultivate scavengers, though they can't be compared to you in experience." Chapter 35. The Dark King, Chapter 35. Jenny. Knight's monthly salary was not low. According to Dudien's estimates, monthly salary of a knight was more than Jura couple's salary together. Moreover, being affiliated with the Ryan family would give him an identity which vast majority of civilians would look up to. However, he did not immediately agree. He understood that the higher the pay, means that scavenging outside the giant wall was more dangerous. Although he had heard that scavengers roam only in safe areas, but there is no guarantee that there will be no other danger. Otherwise, why would they be compensated with such a high return? "I will think about it," muttered Dudien. Feline Ryan smiled and said, "If you come to a decision, know that our family would be happy for you to join. In addition, if you can't find a place to live, it is not a problem. In our Ryan family there are several sets of vacant houses which could be given to you free of charge." Dudien declined, "Thank you for your kindness. I'll be here for 7 days, but later I will have to go home and visit my parents. For time being, I'm not planning to live in the commercial district." "Okay, you are welcome to disturb me if you ever need anything." After the conversation, Feline Ryan left to the central banquet to talk with other nobles. As Feline Ryan left, several nobles came over to find Dudien to talk to him. The conditions proposed by them were not so different by the ones offered by Feline Ryan and were declined by Dudien one by one. All of a sudden, melodious music stopped. A loud clapping echoed and people in the banquet came to halt their chatting, eating, or drinking to look at the source of the noise. It was a 40-year-old middle-aged noble who was clapping. As he saw all the eyes gathered on him, with a slight smile on his face he spoke, "Welcome to the 8th party set up by Mellon Foundation. I hope you all are enjoying your time in here. It just happens to be my daughter, Sarah Mell's, birthday. I hope all of you who are present can give my daughter your blessings." "Thank you." As he finished talking, a girl in a red skirt slowly began to descend from the 2nd floor. She was 12 or 13 years old with delicate cheeks. She gracefully stood and slightly bowed. The nobles who were present began to warmly applause. Dudien's mind was fretting. Beforehand he had inquired about Mellon Consortium. There were more than a dozen noble families of different sizes included in the consortia. However, Mel and Burung family were the co-founders and the most influential ones. The girl belonged to Mel family, who he had heard before when he was in Mission orphanage. Moreover, the Knight of Light Mel who cut the alchemist's head 3 years ago apparently was member of the Mel family. This was a proof of how deep and broad the roots of Mel family reached. Our Prin family has prepared an elegant gift for Miss Sarah. At this time, a young man holding a delicate red gift box came up to Sarah Mel. He gently opened the box where a pair of white silk gloves laid. Sarah took a few steps forward and said, "This should be Master Sidney's craftsmanship. I like it." "Thank you." Young man smiled. A servant came up to him and took the gift box. At this time, the other nobles successively presented gifts with the words of congratulations. A young man in gentleman's suit laughed and said, "I always heard that you like poetry, so I asked Master Tiza to write a poem. I hope you will enjoy." "Poetry?" Sarah's eyes light up with joy. The young man smiled and continued in gentle voice, "These are tears you dropped on the stone. Those hesitant eyes filled with that evening. Who leaked your inner sadness?" After a while, a poem finished, said, "This poem is called A Girl's Sadness, specially written for Miss Sarah." The audience suddenly applauded enthusiastically. Sarah had a happy smile on her face. It is indeed the poem by Tiza Master. So touching and so moving. I like it. Thank you. Dudien was listening to those cheers while leaning to the edge of windowsill. His heart was frustrated as he hadn't brought anything with him. He hoped these people didn't pay any attention to him so as not to provoke any unnecessary trouble. Suddenly, he saw a figure run under the window. Dudien cursed himself for being stupid. If he didn't have anything to gift, then why not to sneak away as the other person? He looked at the nobles whose attention at the moment was on Sarah. Taking advantage of the rare opportunity, he looked outside the windows and determined that the height was about 2 meters. He didn't hesitate as he climbed onto window in one move and jumped out of it as if he was a flexible cat. He walked down the path to quickly leave. In order to avoid encountering the servants, Dudien walked around the more remote areas. Here were no lights. At the moment it was lighted by rays of the moon and the stars. He walked on the stone path surrounded by trimmed ornamental trees. It didn't take long before he reached a small pavilion. He sat there to wait till the banquet to finish. He would go back then. He was not someone of high birth, so his disappearance would not be too noticeable. Rustle. Suddenly, their leaves shook. Dudien's face slightly changed and he shouted low tone, "Who is there?" There was no more movement, but Dudien knew from the sound of wind that there was a person. After all, 3 years of rough scavenger training, he had gone through many experiences and could determine what were in his surroundings through the voices. "Come out, I know you're there," Dudien said. Before long, a slender figure moved from behind the trimmed ball-like tree. Under the illumination of the moonlight, Dudien saw a girl who was almost as big as him. It seems that he had seen her before but couldn't figure out. Dudien, relieved, said, "Come out. I have no malicious thoughts. I'm hiding from the limelight. I'll not inform you and you'd better not inform on me. Otherwise it will be bad for both of us." This girl was nervous at first, but as she heard Dudien's talk, she was surprised. "You aren't sent by my father to call me back?" Dudien knew she had misunderstood, so he shrugged. "Of course not, I do not even know you." The girl looked at him in relieved manner. "You scared me. You said you are hiding, from what?" Dudien snapped. "I haven't brought a gift, so I'm here to avoid the embarrassment." "What?" The girl seems to suspect that she heard the wrong. Thinking about Dudien's words, she smiled. "Poochie, oh, didn't you know that today is Miss Sarah Mel's birthday?" Don't me." Dudien shrugged. "I just didn't know." The girl walked along the slate to the edge of the pavilion. She saw Dudien's uniform and asked, "This uniform? Are you a scavenger?" Suddenly Dudien looked black, and said, "Yes, but you'd better not talk about seeing me over here. Or else I will tell about you too." "I will not say." The girl smiled and said, "My name is Jenny, what is your name?" Dudien replied, "Dean." Chapter 36. The Dark King, Chapter 36. A Tree in Blossom. Alchemists have come up with a sinister plan. They advise us to use plugins to block reader who haven't whitelisted us. Holy Church is against the decision. What kind of world is outside the giant wall? The girl looked curiously at Dudien. Is there a endless seas and vast expanse of forests as bards tell? Dudien turned back to the pavilion, looked for a chair and sat down, shrugging. I have just been appointed scavengers, and have not been outside the giant wall. But there are seas and forests, that's for sure. How do you know? Jenny followed him to the pavilion, sitting on the chair opposite the tea table, wondering, did not you say you have not been outside the giant wall? Dudien's mind suddenly thought of the earth. He have seen the blue sea and forests. And many beautiful scenery. His heart was saddened and he murmured, of course, I have seen. Have you seen? Jenny was surprised. Dudien recoiled, and said, it is in the poet's poem to see. But I believe that those who certainly exist, otherwise, how the bards would know about them. Do you think so? Jenny, pleasantly surprised, said, I think so too, but my father always said that those are made up by bards. In reality they do not exist. Even if there is something like that, we would never step outside the giant wall. He said it is very dangerous outside, is that so? Dudien thought to himself. Most probably your father was afraid that you are too curious and would secretly ran to the outside the giant wall to peep at the scene. He said, the danger does exist. Is it really dangerous? Jenny's eyes were a bit disappointed. Dudien saw her sad eyes, suddenly felt himself as if killed off a good hope. He couldn't bear to break her heart, so he continued, however, although there is danger, but it does not mean that there is no sea and forest. I believe, one day, the danger outside the giant wall will disappear and we will be able to go out and see the mountains and the sea and everything. Jenny's face shone brightly and said, really? Really, replied Dudien in serious manner. Jenny's face smiled and said, I think so too. I had told my father about it before, but he told me to give up the idea. He said the outside of the giant wall is unknown place. In addition, he said that only special personnel such as you can go outside the wall, other people are prohibited from entering. Dudien smiled, did not say anything. I really want to go outside the giant wall. Jenny's face full of longing. Suddenly, she thought of something, looked at Dudien, said, since the giant wall so dangerous, why do scavengers go outside? Dudien thought but didn't say that this has to be answered by the nobles. However, as the girl's age is still small, apparently not involved in these aristocratic politics, I don't know the reason. Perhaps like you, just want to go outside to see. Jennifer looked at him with a trace of admiration. You are so powerful. Obviously we are same age, but you are more brave than I am. Because I'm a boy, Dudien smiled. Hearing this, Jenny's face turned red. She secretly looked up to Dudien. She saw that he didn't notice her embarrassed appearance, and her heart was relieved. But her heartbeat was slightly accelerated. How can I and a boy be in a garden alone? If father knew, no. No. He can't learn about it. She was going to bid farewell to Dudien and leave. Do not misunderstand. I do not discriminate against women. In our training camp there were many girls. But I think you should still listen to your father's advice. Outside the giant wall is indeed very dangerous. You just have to wait until those dangers are swept out. Sooner or later you will be able to see the outside world. I believe that day won't take long. By the faint moonlight, Jenny looked at the boy's serious and confident look. She could not help but startled a moment, subconsciously asked, really? Aha. Dudien nodded affirmatively. Jenny heard his words. It seems as if she was infected by them. I believe you. Dudien smiled and said, I believe in myself. Jenny smiled. Poochie. Her previous intention to leave has long been missing. You know, my dream is to become a magistrate. Although the official cannot go outside the giant wall, but at least can judge all the bad inside the giant wall. I believe that there are no bad people in the world, and if we work together we will soon be able to remove the danger outside the giant wall. Dudien smiled and said, do you learn the law? Of course. Jenny grinned, showing a proud expression. Dudien laughed, I just learned the law. Jenny said with surprise, have you also learned the law? Self-learning, Dudien added. You want to be a magistrate? Well, my goal is as great as yours. Great. Yes, our goals are great. How old are you? Just turned 11. I'm almost 12. The darkness gradually deepened. The more they talked, the more they were unaware of how the time flew. They talked about lots of things, from their hobbies to their ages, as well as their views on things. They had way too much in common, as if they had found long-lost friends. One without ears, one without tail, giggle. Jenny clutched her stomach because of laughing hard. She completely forgot to pay attention to the image of nobility, said, "What a strange son. So strange lyrics. It's fun now." Dudien said, "It is a children's song." Jenny smiled, thinking, how can there be such a strange children's songs? Dudien just wanted to say a few more children's songs. Suddenly he felt a mosquito bite his wrist. He shot with his backhand to kill it. The sudden sound woke up them from the sweet chat. They looked back at the direction of the banquet hall. Jenny saw his move, also reacted. She felt bad. I have to go back. If my father cannot find me, he will be very angry. Dudien is also just ready to go back, said, then you go first. I will wait a while. Let's not be caught seen together. Jenny's face turned red. She ran outside the pavilion, suddenly though of something, and turned back. You just said you also heard a lot of nice poetry. I also like poetry. Can you tell me one? Dudien was surprised for a moment. She was not sheltered under the pavilion. The moonshines were reflected on her cheek. This moment, she was as beautiful as unreal fairy. His heart was throbbing subconsciously. He knew a lot of Tang poetry, which was classified as Eastern classical poetry. It was totally different from this era's poetry genre. Suddenly, he thought of the modern poetry which her sister often read. How do I let you meet me? At my most beautiful moment. For this, I beseech the God for 500 years. I asked him to let us meet in earthly life. God, let me become a tree, grown on the roadside that you pass by every day. Dudien remembered that this poem was called A Tree in Blossom. He had changed the word Buddha to God while reciting. After all, the faith of the world is dictated by the Holy Church and there is no Buddhism. Hearing Dudien quietly recite the verse, Jenny was stunned. After a while she turned around and fled along the trail to disappear in the darkness. Chapter 37. The Dark King, Chapter 37. 2 Blessings. It was about 10 minutes that Jenny had left when Dudien began to walk through the trail towards the estate. He was reaching the banquet hall when he heard bursts of hearty laughter from far away. It seems the party had finished, as Dudien saw the banquet hall's door completely open. One after another nobles came out in groups. Dudien did not expect for his timing to be the online with banquet's ending. In his heart he was thankful to the mosquito which had bitten his wrist. He didn't enter the banquet hall but instead walked down the main road towards the outside of the manor. He used another route to join the main road to close up to entrance of the banquet hall. There was no noble, so he trotted past, pretending to come out from the banquet hall, as if ready to return back home any moment. He saw that there were only 7 or 8 carriages left in comparison to large numbers of them that were neatly parked close by to each other when they had initially came over. Dudien's heart was relieved when he saw Peter's carriage standing outside. He went over but there was no one in the carriage. It was clear that Peter had yet to come out. Dudien first sat in the carriage, waiting inside. Before long, Peter drifted back in an extremely drunk state. He saw Dudien inside the carriage. You? How? You here? You, me, admired, Long. He was in a state where he couldn't express himself. Peter's body was shaking. Dudien helped him into the carriage. Dudien was dumbfounded as he said, you shouldn't drink more. Come sit over for a break. Higher-ups, orders, in the next must do so. Peter speak too vague to understand anything out of his speech. However, he obediently went inside the carriage and sat down to lean on his right side. Dudien watched Peter's non-stop giggling. He sighed, lifted the curtain and said to the driver, go back. Yes, sir, said the coachman respectfully and then shook the rope. They first dropped off Peter and later came to the temporary accommodation castle provided by the Melon Consortia where Dudien got off. It was late night so Mason and others were in deep sleep. Except the gatekeepers on shift, the rest of the attendants, servants, and maids were resting. Dudien returned to his room to lie on bed. A lot of things emerged in his mind that he had encountered in the party. There was both humiliation and anger. He thought about beautiful girls that brought joy to his mind. Gradually he fell asleep. The following day, early in the morning, Dudien just woke up to Peter had come over to the castle carrying a wooden box. "Good morning, Mr. Peter," said Dudien, greeting him. Dudien was surprised as he didn't expect Peter, who was so drunk last night, to be awake and so fresh early in the morning. Peter smiled and said, "Last night I was way too drunk. Coachman said that you had sent me back home. This is how it should be, doesn't it, Dot?" Dudien looked at the small box in his hand and said, "What's this?" Peter put the box on the table in the living room and opened the box. There was a syringe that Dudien had previously seen. He understood that the reason Peter had come was to give him the God's blessing. "Yesterday you were just transferred over, so did not have time to use it on you. I assume there is no need for introduction about what this is. Dean, you will get 2 blessings. First is on the basis of distribution, the other is your first month's quota. The other one will be issued to you exactly this day of next month." Peter laughed. "Would you let me take it home and use it myself?" asked Dudien. "Of course not," Peter shook his head. "This is the power of the Holy Church, which is the gift of God. The rule is that it must be seen by the witnesses when it is used. I brought it to you, so I'm your witness." Dudien regretted as the chance to research the syringe was lost. However, thinking about it, he had no proper equipment for the research, so there was no way to study it. "Come on, first," Peter said, taking the syringe from the box. Dudien was lacking in trust department, so he asked, "This, no problems, right?" Peter's face turned cold. "I'm going to forget what you had said. Do not even think about talking like this somewhere outside. It is same as questioning the God." Dudien naturally understand this point, so he had to select words tactfully in the future. If he didn't directly question, there won't be any problems. "Do not worry. This is the gift of the God. There has never been adverse reaction since the first scavenger that had used it," Peter answered. Dudien did not say anything but was surprised. It was an awe-inspiring moment from a scientist's perspective. How did the Holy Church create such a perfect gene agent? Is it possible to mass-produce scavengers? Peter injected the fluid inside the syringe into Dudien's arm. He felt no pain, just felt some numbness. Soon, all of the pink fluid inside the syringe was pushed into his body. Dudien felt a surge of enthusiasm that was spreading into his body and limbs. A violent heat flew to his brain. It felt as if the whole blood inside his body was blown to his mind in a matter of seconds. He roared loudly and the heat began to flow in reverse back to his body and limbs. It felt very painful, as it was almost like someone was trying to tear his limbs apart. He bit his teeth to bear the pain. Soon, this heat like a tide of water faded away. Dudien looked up and immediately felt different. His vision was very sensitive. He could see small details of Peter's face that he was not aware before. Dudien thought of Lorien's strength, immediately jumped in place. Dudien felt like flying. With a single jump he had reached almost the level of Peter's head. He fell back to the ground. Raising his hand, he grabbed a chair. It felt as light as catkins. "Well, wait a minute and then we can use the second one," Peter laughed. Dudien looked at the second syringe Peter had picked up, and asked, "Is it going to feel like this every time?" Peter smiled and said, "Of course not. The initial injection, the effect will be very significant. But your body will get used to it, so the effect will be weaker as you get more injections." Dudien although expected this, but still cannot help but regret. If the effect could be doubled or tripled, then simply a monster-like existence will appear at the result of using genetic agents of Holy Church. They were just scavengers and had such terrible power. So what an existence a hunter was. Soon, Peter injected the second syringe into Dudien's arm. The heat flowed again from his body. This time it was not as strong as before, and Dudien only felt a slight tearing and the heat flew down. Dudien looked again, immediately feel their vision clear a lot. He knew that his power had improved a lot. He thought he could bare-handed kill a tiger if he had faced it. "Go ahead and teach the others," Peter laughed. Dudien nodded slightly. Mason cried hard. Before long, all the injection were completed. For a time the whole castle was extraordinarily noisy, everyone was jumping, experiencing the incredible power they had acquired. After Peter left, Dudien returned to his room to pack up. He was ready to return to the residential district. We can live for free for 3 days. Are you going today? We also intend to go to the busy downtown market today. Why are you in a hurry? This is such a rare opportunity. Mason and the other two tried to persuade Dudien. However, Dudien had already made his mind. He bid farewell to them, called a carriage and went to residential district. As soon as the carriage reached Lin Kong Street number 108, Dudien jumped out of it. He paid 60 copper coins. His heart was in pain, as the carriage hired in commercial district would charge twice the amount for same distance in comparison to carriage hired in residential district or in slums. At this time, Dudien suddenly saw another carriage parked by their door. Are there any guests? He wondered. He bypassed the carriage, opened the door outside the white fence and was about to enter the house when he heard the voices of outgoing quarrel. He was surprised. He raised his hand and knocked on the door. Soon, the door was opened by Jura. She looked strangely at Dudien, said, "You are." After 3 years of scavenger training, Dudien's appearance has also undergone tremendous changes. His build was a lot stronger than the original, color was not so pale but tanned into the wheat color. As a result, Jura actually did not recognize it. "Auntie, it's me," said Dudien. Jura heard his voice that had changed a little. "You are Dean." Dudien lightly chuckled, "The training is over, I'm back." Jura's eyes suddenly flushed. She embraced Dudien with her arms. "You come back. You finally come back. Your uncle and I feared for you that you were in some kind of trouble. It's good that you are okay." She immediately pushed Dudien, looked up and down at him. She was relieved as she saw his hands and feet intact. Dudien's heart warmed up as he saw her so exaggerated. He smiled and said, "Originally wanted to buy you few specialties from commercial district. I had no money so didn't buy anything. Silly child. You coming back alive and well is a gift." Jura smiled and touched Dudien's hair. "The 3 years have gone by. You are so high, and over there. Do not go too far." At this point, an angry voice came from the living room. It was Gray's voice. Jura's face changed, and quickly turned back to the living room. Chapter 38. The Dark King, Chapter 38. Boundaries. Dudien also followed into the living room. Dudien saw 2 figures in addition to Gray in the living room. One was obese with a big belly. There were 3 or 4 gold rings on his fingers. Another was a slender man wearing a suit. His hair was combed neatly, looking like a noble. "Gray, pay attention to your attitude." Dudien came in just to hear the slim man's wailing sound. Gray clenched his fist tightly, his face looked at him angrily, said, "We have purchased this house. The amount of the tax was written on the contract and it was been paid. For you to raise the origin tax, it is just simply illegal." Obese middle-aged man chuckled, said, "You are a small tailor. Do you even know what law is? This whole Lin Kong Street is mine. It is my territory. Whatever I say is the law. Even if you want to go to trial, I welcome you to do so anytime." Gray gritted his teeth and said, "You are thief." "Well, this is slander. I have been personally attacked, I can sue you for this." Slim Man spoke in a cold tone. At this time, Jura looked at the red face of Gray and hurried to hold his hand. "This matter. Give us some time to discuss it. Such a high tax, we really cannot afford to pay." Obese middle-aged man said lightly, "You are sensible. But we had already given you few days. Today is the last day. I will come back at night and I hope you will give me a satisfactory answer." Finished, he stood up to leave. "Wait a minute." At this time, Dudien stood in front of the obese man. "Ah." Obese middle-aged looked at this kid who was up to his shoulder. He frowned. "Little guy, who are you?" At this time, Gray also noticed Dudien. He saw Dudien's completely changed appearance, stunned. "Dean. You come back." Dudien nodded slightly, and then looked up at the obese middle-aged. "With a body like that it would be very hard for you to make trip back and forth. Actually, we don't like to be disturbed in our home." Obese middle-aged smiled and said, "Little guy, I heard Gray has adopted a child, is that you?" Dudien did not answer him, but continued, "First of all, according to land law, Chapter 3, Article 6, a one-time purchase of land and real estate, property tax must be paid off with the housing money. When Jura and Gray bought this house, they had already paid for it. Or else they would not have got the proof for the property. In the 7th verse of the 4th chapter of the law, all the vesting of authority and taxation of the house shall be to the owner of the house, and only the lord of the house shall have the right to reclaim it. Dudien looked at him, said, "You said that the entire Lin Kong Street is your territory. How can you prove it? Even if you want to collect tax, you have to go to trial so that a magistrate should look into your proposition. You will have to prove them that you are the lord of the territory to be able to obtain tax contracts, right?" Obese middle-aged was shocked. The slim one startled a bit, his face fell. "Little guy, what nonsense are you talking? What kind of proof do you want to see?" Dudien looked up at him and calmly said, "If you do not have proof, the lordship, please leave and do not bother me any more. Otherwise, I will arrest you as a criminal who infiltrates the inhabitants." Hearing this, all of them were surprised. Slim Man smiled and said, "Arrest me? Little guy, I have been spouting nonsense since the beginning. Be careful or I will send you directly to the guards. No need to go anywhere. I am already a guard." Dudien took out his guard medal and continued. "Indifferently, as you just talked to me in a way like that, I can sue you for slandering a guard and get you arrested. I think, in the 7th article of the law records, for malicious slander of aristocracy you can be sentenced to 3 years in prison. There is 2 years of prison sentence for slandering guards. In case of an attack against the guard, the sentence is death. What do you want?" Dudien looked up at them. Obese middle-aged and slim men looked at the guard's medal. They were speechless. Jura couples, to see this familiar medal, cannot help but startled and soon remembered the purpose of training for 3 years. There was surprise and excitement in their eyes. They didn't think that Dudien had succeeded. You are guard." Obese middle-aged was shocked. It was the first time that he had met such a small guard. "Are you questioning me?" said Dudien indifferently. Obese middle-aged man quickly shook his head. Although it was incredible, but he still recognized this medal. He knew that posing as a guard was a big crime. "It was the first time I saw such a small, so young and promising guard." Obese middle-aged smiled drily. "Dudien Plain, this is the proof that you are not really lords. There are lots of guards like me. At the age of 16 years there are lots of guards who join nobility for experience. Afterwards will be transferred to boundary wall, between the districts and later on to the giant wall." The boundary wall that he had referred to was known as Wall of Rich and Poor by the aristocracy. Obese middle-aged man was embarrassed. "Here I am really the lord. My grandfather was a great knight, was sealed to this territory, but, afterwards he couldn't continue. But this land was awarded by a noble to unite grandfather. He is gone, so the territory has lost its legitimacy. Perhaps the noble forgot to recover the land, so you have continued to lord over the place. It is not legal," he said indifferently, "but I think if you go away, I can reconsider it." Obese middle-aged and slim men, as one, immediately bowed and said, "Then we will leave." Then, he moved away from the side of Dudien around. Before long, the carriage had left with no trace of both of them. Dudien looked up at the Jura couple. 3 years have passed. There were light wrinkles on their eyes. They were more than 30 years old, but in this world living up to 30 was same as being 50 years old in the old era. Jura couple recovered. They surprised to see Dudien, as they did not expect it to solve the previous trouble easily. In a few short words that Dudien had said resolved everything. Gray said, "You graduated. Worthy of my son, awesome. Unexpectedly, my, Gray's, child will be a guard. Haha, tomorrow I will go to the factory and show off in front of the workers. They will envy me." Jura White at him, smiled and touched Dudien's hair, said, "You child, all tan so black." It had been 3 bitter years. Dudien smiled and said, "It was nothing. Although, this time I can't stay for long. After a few days, I will have to go to perform a task. Afterwards I will come back." Jura stunned for a moment. "What task? Is it dangerous?" "No danger, rest assured." "That's good." Gray smiled. "When the guards can have any danger? They do nothing but accompany nobles around. Moreover, there is Holy Church who protects us from evil demons." Jura snapped, "I'm just afraid." Gray smiled and shook his head. Do not say anything. Later that evening, Jura prepared a very rich dinner to celebrate the return of Dudien and him becoming a guard. After dinner, Dudien said to them, Auntie, I want to borrow some money this time. Jura laughed. How much do you want? 10 silver coins. Dudien thought that the money should be enough to buy enough materials to make gunpowder. He would use it for defense in case of any danger outside the giant wall. Chapter 39. The Dark King, Chapter 39. Apprentice. Funny thing, as I translated chapter's name, Donald Trump's name popped up in my mind. So much. Jura was shocked. Gray's monthly salary was about 2 silver coins. As for Jura, her salary was slightly higher but only about 3 silver coins. Unless she visited some rich noble she wouldn't get extra commission. 10 silver coins was equivalent to their 2-month salary in total. What are you going to do with that much money? Gray frowned. I need that for my mission needs. At the end of the task, I will give you back. Dudien seriously said. Judah and Gray looked at each other, reluctantly replied, Well, it's all right. But you have to promise us that you are not going to use this money to do bad things. Dudien was relieved. However, he was also aware that Jura couple gave him the money because of his guard identity. If his occupation was something else he would not be provided with the money. Early in the morning Dudien went over to Southern Adventurers Market in the residential district. All districts, whether slums, residential or commercial districts, were divided into 4 regions. East and West regions were always vast in size compared to other regions. Dudien's family lived in Lin Kong Street, which was located in southeast of the residential district. The so-called Southern Adventurers Market was a place for civilian to do free trade. Most of the goods that were sold in the area were brought from the outer edge of the giant wall. The nuclear radiation was intensive in the outer zone in comparison to other areas. So only adventurers were willing to go there. That's how the market was named, in honor of those adventurers. An adventurer was not a long-term career, most of them would retire after few times of risk-taking. They would earn enough money to support the erosion of their body for the rest of their lives. Dudien was not worried about the nuclear radiation as he had checked the information beforehand. Lead was extensively used in making his uniform. It was effective in resisting the radiation. Moreover, he had free access to outer edge of the giant wall. It was just not worth for him to go alone to search for materials. Purchasing them was much more time effective. The market was far away from his house and Dudien was not interested in losing time. He spent 5 copper coins to reach the Southern Adventurers Market by carriage. It was a crowded bazaar. There were blankets and carpets covering the ground and were used as booths. Materials were neatly arranged on those carpets by the sellers. Their noisy voices and shouts of advertisement covered the entire market. Dudien strolled down the aisle. Half an hour later, Dudien finally found a few stalls which sold sulfur ore. He was searching for crystal saltpeter too. As for charcoal powder, he could make it on his own and didn't want to waste money to buy it. The seller was a middle-aged man with dark complexion. His hair was scattered, while there were some red spots on his hands. Most probably he was infected with some kind of a disease while adventuring in the outer edge of the giant wall. He was using long-sleeved clothing for cover, but inadvertently his was exposing those red marks while raising his hands. Dudien knew that man's body radiation level was very high. Most probably he had few years of life left, unless he would get a treatment from Holy Church. After bargain, they agreed on 1 silver and 20 copper coins. Dudien was going to buy all the saltpeter and sulfur ore. Saltpeter was more valuable, that costed a silver coin. Using all these materials I can make few packs of explosives at best. As I'm going to take food and basic weapons, there is bound to take additional things while I will be on task. Gunpowder isn't that heavy, so it should not be a problem. Anyway, there is no point in purchasing more raw materials, this should be enough. Dudien was calculating the possible outcomes in his mind. Little guy, these things are very heavy. You should either call your family for help or get a carriage. Do you want me to help you get a carriage? The seller who had received the money said to Dudien. No need. Dudien replied. Everything was put into linen bags. For a normal person it would be very hard to carry them, but for Dudien it felt as heavy as feathers of a bird. He grabbed the linen bags and went away. The middle-aged man was startled and stared at Dudien with wide eyes as he spoke away. It was not long before Dudien bought basic tools at other stalls for use and refined the gunpowder. In the eyes of ordinary people, the role of these tools were not related with alchemy. For example, there was an apparatus used by doctors to grind materials into powder while making pills. By noon, Dudien had bought everything that he needed. He was strolling around the market to see if there was something extraordinary that could catch his eyes. He felt hungry, so he turned to leave for dinner. "Boss. Sell me for a coin, please. It's just a broken stone." Suddenly, a tender sound echoed in Dudien's eyes. Out of curiosity, he turned to look sideways. He saw a boy half head shorter than him who was carrying a linen bag in his left hand while holding a rough black stone size of a large fist on his right hand. The seller was a thin young man. He shook his head and said, "This is an iron ore. Although the weight is not much, you gotta pay at least twice the amount." "Boss, even if this is an iron ore, it is only an ore, not iron. It is so small that even after refining you won't get much of an iron." Boy changed his strategy. "It is so small that smelting factory wouldn't even need it. No one will buy it. It will just stay here. Sell it to me and you will have your copper coin." Thin young man hesitated for a while but ultimately said, "Well, all right." The boy grinned, paid for it and put the black stone into the linen bag. He turned to walk away. Dudien was about to go when his eyes caught a small tattoo which was on boy's wrist. A small black hook pattern was drawn. "Alchemist's apprentice." Dudien did not expect to meet one in here. From Roseyard's notes he had learned of lifestyle and habits of alchemists. The most impressive thing about them was that every alchemist would have a dedicated tattoo design on their body. It was a sign used by alchemists to identify each other. Without a tattoo, no one would be accepted into their circle. The tattooing method was very basic. They would use powder of some plants and mix it with black water. Afterwards, a needle would be used to sketch out the pattern. Moreover, even a small dot without no shape or line could be considered as a sign. Although tattoos were not only exclusive to alchemists, as nobles and Holy Church used them too. But they would avoid using black pigment. If there was a black color on tattoos, even if you were a noble or member of Holy Church, you would be treated as an alchemist. It can be said that it was an absolute proof used to identify them. Similarly, if you don't have black tattoos, even if you are true alchemists, you would not be recognized by the other colleagues. Dudien glanced at the direction that boy left. Carrying the linen bags, he quietly went after him to catch up. Chapter 40. The Dark King, Chapter 40. Tubes. The linen bag that the boy was carrying was small. Obviously he was not as strong as Dudien because it didn't take long before he began to breathe heavily. Dudien's vision was 3 times better than the ordinary person's because of God's blessing. He was trailing the boy from far behind. Because of his age, at best he is an apprentice alchemist. It's just who he had bought the materials for. Is it for his own use or to help out his teacher? Dudien was pondering while walking after the boy. The boy stopped at the junction and got onto a carriage. Dudien's face slightly changed and ran after to catch up after them. The area was bustling with the people, so the carriage's speed was not fast. Fortunately, Dudien's body was strengthened because of 3 years of hellish training and God's blessing, so that his stamina was enough to follow after them 7 or 8 streets. Dudien was having problems with his breath when the carriage suddenly stopped. The kid jumped from the carriage after he paid for the ride and entered a roadside alley. Dudien immediately went over, pretending to be passing by the road. He looked at the alley but was startled. It was a dead end sealed by walls on all 3 sides. The boy had disappeared. Damn it. Dudien frowned. He didn't believe in fairy tales such as existence of magic. So he accepted the fact that the boy disappeared just like that. He entered the valley and carefully checked the ground for footsteps. As it was a sealed alley, few people used it. It was dusty everywhere. Garbage was piled up in some parts. Dudien focused his sharp vision and saw stampede footprints on the ground. The trail spread towards the middle of the alley to the front of a wall. He came closer to the part of the wall where footprints had disappeared. He carefully touched the wall. It was coated and colored to look like the wall. Actually, if he hadn't touched it, he wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Hidden entrance. Dudien touched everywhere to feel the hard structure behind the entrance. It was made so that the hidden entrance wouldn't be exposed by wind or rats. Dudien noted down the address and went out. If he informed the address of the alchemist's base to the Holy Church, then as a scavenger, he would receive a lot of financial gains. However, he was not interested on such a thing. On the contrary, he was ready to join the underworld of the alchemists. After all, except the Roseyard's notes, he didn't have any kind of knowledge regarding the alchemists. Although he had recorded a lot of things in the notes, but many high-level alchemists mastered and learned the information about basic nature of things by heart instead of recording. To join the alchemist circle, he had to be an alchemist. The first step towards that was to ink a black tattoo. Dudien took another look at the alley and went back to the intersection. He stopped a carriage and went to the slums. From young age he had learned that he had to be as efficient as possible. Soon, the carriage came to the slums. The air-blowing thick stinky smell hit him as soon as they approached the slums. There was a hint of frustration in his heart. Enduring the smell, he went towards a remote place to find a dilapidated small hotel to rent. In the hotel room, Dudien took out some of the raw material in the linen bag. The first step was to extract the sulfur ore from the sulfur. He was prepared to use the most primitive refining method to heat the sulfur ore and dissolve it. Afterwards he would have to cool the upper layer and grind it using stone wheel to produce sulfur powder. It was rainy season at the moment. Dudien paid a few copper coins to the hotel's owner so that he could get few pieces of coal from the dusty brazier. Dudien returned to his room and locked the door. He began to heat the sulfur ore by burning the coals. After a while he understood that he would need more coal, so he went back to hotel owner to buy a big bag of coal. The melting point of sulfur is not high, so it soon melted. Dudien had prepared all the purchased equipment in advance, so there was not much of a delay in the production of sulfur powder. The room was incensed in sulfur smell. Dudien had long prepared and worn a mask. Due to the nuclear radiation, masks seemed not to disappear but still widely used even though the technology hadn't progressed at all. It was true that different environments promote different developments. According to Roseyard's notes, all the alchemists were using masks as they were dealing with all kinds of experiments and inevitable could intake toxic substances. The role of the masks were minimal but still widely available. By the evening, Dudien finally had enough amount of sulfur powder and charcoal powder. He was ready to produce the gunpowder, which was a simple thing given he had all the basic necessities. I wouldn't have expected to produce gunpowder in a condition such as this. Dudien looked at his clothes smoldered dirty by coal. He yearned for the future where he would have his own dedicated alchemy room for the experiments. I hope I can make a fortune with this trip to the outside of the giant wall. Dudien wiped off the dirt on his face. In the blink of an eye, 7 days passed. The night before the task, Dudien left his house to Commercial District. The Mellon Foundation had sent a carriage to take him and the other scavengers to the headquarters. Mason, Dudien, Sham, Zach and others stayed in a small castle provided for free of charge. I heard that tomorrow morning we will start. Mason excitedly said, at last tomorrow I will be able to outside the giant wall. Since small age, when I heard those horrible stories told about the outside world, I have yearned to see what is it really out there. I don't think it is as bad as the stories tell about, but it is definitely dangerous. Zach said. Sham smiled, looking at things that Dudien had brought with him. Dean, what are those? Toys, said Dudien casually, glancing at the small tubes that were filled with powder and ready to explode at any given time. Chapter 41. The Dark King, Chapter 41. The Passage. The next morning at dawn everyone was up and ready outside the castle. There were dozens of horses outside the castle. They belonged to black horse breed which had a strong resistance to diseases and radiation. Get ready, said Peter. He was already on top of a horse and he had the posture of a graceful knight. Dudien selected a black horse and jumped over to sit on it. If it had been before the God's blessing injection, he would have to use a ladder to climb the horse. Let's go. Pete shouted when everyone was seated on horses. His legs clinging to the belly of the horse, he was the first to move. Dudien, who pulled the reins, followed. Even though the horses had massive build and scary appearance, they were very obedient creatures by nature and it was very easy to control them. The streets were covered with fog. Crisp sounds of horse gallops were heard as they moved through. Under the leadership of Peter, Dudien and others speed off towards the outer edge of the Commercial District. As they moved forward, they saw the vague shadow of the giant wall far away in the horizon. The outline was becoming increasingly clear as the distance covered was increased. The giant wall seemed like a creeping monster behind the fog, giving people an oppressive feeling. Outside the commercial district, same as with the residential district, was a large undeveloped and desolate wasteland. It was not suitable for cultivation or for people to settle. As they were passing by the desolate zone, the black horses became restless, as if they were excited and manic because of some unknown variable which made them to run faster. After 10 minutes of straight ride, the hazy figure of the giant wall gradually cleared up in crowd's vision. The picture that they saw was deeply imprinted in their hearts and minds. It was a very tall wall. Almost impossible to see its top. The more close they got, harder it got to grasp its height. It almost reached the clouds. It gave the impression that it was built by gods but no humans. Dudien couldn't differentiate the construction's blocks, like it was a complete natural boulder that was put there to divide the world into two. This is the giant wall. Including Dudien, everyone was shocked as they reached the giant wall. The crowd felt like ants in comparison to the giant wall's size. "Father, it's too high." Mason looked up. His neck folded almost 90 degrees, but still couldn't see the top of the giant wall. Zach stared authentic. Did our ancestors build the giant wall? Everyone was struck by this great and magnificent project. Dudien knew very well that it would be an enormous project to build a giant wall like this one. Even in the old days, it would be extremely difficult to build it. Countless amount of time, manpower, and resources would be needed for the construction. The outbreak of the disaster was sudden, so there was no time to project and implement such a super shelter. He couldn't imagine how the ones who survived the nuclear bombing shower built such an incredible architectural miracle. This is the sanctuary of our Sylvian giants. Our ancestors and gods came together to build it. There was a trace of pride in Peter's eyes. He turned and looked at the crowd, smiled. "Come with me, little guys. In about 100 meters we will reach the destination. All of you should dismount and rope your mounts." A heavy iron gate was opened by Peter while echoing squeaky sounds. Peter's arm strength was in an incomprehensible level as he alone moved the giant gate. There was a ladder leading to the underground below the gate. "Go in," said Peter. One by one, the newly appointed scavengers went into the tunnel under the iron gate. Peter was the last one to go in, so he closed the iron gate. Everyone felt isolated and panicked because of the darkness that was surrounding them. "Aren't we going outside the giant wall?" the girl in the back timidly asked. Peter smiled and said, "What are you so afraid of? It seems that Tobu didn't properly train your courage in the last 3 years. So we are not going to pass from the top." "Are there no passages through the top?" said Dudien. "Of course not," said Peter, urging, "Hurry up, everyone is waiting for you." Dudien surprised, "There are others." "Of course, although you all have graduation from the scavenger camp, but it is the first time that you would be going outside the giant wall. The headquarters had arranged another old-timer team to escort you on your first trip. They are the scavengers cultivated by the families. Their foundation is not as good as yours, but they have rich experience from roaming outside the giant wall. Keep your eyes open and learn as much as you can from them," Peter said. Step by step they went down the ladder. They had gone down approximately 100 or so meters. At last they reached the bottom. In front of everyone there was a spacious underground passage. Both sides of the passage were lighted by oil lamps. There were some patterns on the walls. "This is the goddess of harvest." Peter pointed to the wall. A graceful woman's picture was carved on the wall, said, "You have a good prayer. I wish you lots of harvest in this trip." Everyone had seen the statues of different goddesses at areas designed by Holy Church in the residential district. They were no stranger to them. Following the Peter, they stopped in front of the goddess of harvest, clasped their hands and bowed to make their prayers. "This is the goddess of the hunt." Peter pointed to another heroic-looking woman, said, "Every time the hunters travel, they will worship the goddess of the hunt to bless them to hunt smoothly." He then take the lead to go forward. Dudien, who finished praying, followed behind him. The spacious passage was extremely long, about 200 to 300 meters in length. At the end of the pass there was a ladder which took them upwards. As they reached the end of the ladder, Peter opened another huge iron gate and they saw the skylight. Dudien followed Peter out. There were around 20 people, sitting or standing around 10 meters away. At last Peter. Could you be any more slow? At this time, a light laughter echoed. A tall, young man in a black uniform wearing two-edged sword and a black mask came towards Dudien's group. Peter laughed. What are you so anxious about? It's still early. Young man's eyes sweep over the group and said, I heard in the new batch there is good quality seed. I was told that there is hope for him to become a hunter. Pete raised his hand and patted Dudien's shoulder and smiled. It's him. You gotta take care of him. The youth looked at Dudien and laughed. No problem. We have not much time. We gotta start. When we come back I will find you for a drink, remember it will be your treat. It's me who always pays anyway. Peter smiled loudly and looked to Dudien and others. I wish you well. Remember no unauthorized actions. Do not leave the team. I hope 10 days later I will see everyone safe and sound. Then, turned into the underground passage to left. Dudien looked back and saw the towering gigantic wall behind him. He did not expect the passage to be underground. Chapter 42. The Dark King, Chapter 42. Number 8. One chapter today. Tomorrow we will, let's just keep it as a secret for now. My name is Scott, this is my partner, Mia. As Peter left, the youth in black uniform pointed to a slender tall woman standing next to him. I'll be the captain of the team in the next 10 days of scavenging. It's best in your own interests if you listen to my commands. Otherwise there will be big repercussions and penalties when we come back to Consortia. Mason, Zach and several other boys promised to obediently follow the captain after hearing the punishment part. Scott said to Dudien, little boy, what's your name? Dean, Dudien replied. You may have potential, Scott said, nodding slightly. But do not be proud and blinded by it. The death may be waiting around the corner. Stay behind me at all times and I'll tell you what to watch out for. So he is going to be teaching me, thought Dudien. He nodded in to show that he understood. Everyone heard their chat as their voices were loud enough to echo around. Most of them were envious in their hearts but avoided to speak out. After all, Dudien was first in the course results. He also received 2 blessings, whether it was by force or identity they couldn't shake his position. Moreover 3 of his closest bedroom brothers were backing him up too. Even if they acted on anger they couldn't bear the consequences by daring to provoke Dudien, Mason, Zach and Sham. Well, here's your 10 days of dry food and water rations. This time we brought them for you but the next time you should go to headquarters to pick them. Scott pointed to the ground where more than a dozen black backpacks were. Dudien looked at the black traveler's backpack. Lifted up one and untied the rope. The backpack was filled with mud balls. He had seen them in Jura's house. They were mashed potato balls, the taste was very unpalatable but easy to eat. Actually if you ate one, you will have no appetite to eat the second. Mason, Zach and Shem followed behind the Dudien to pick the backpacks. They chose the slightly larger backpacks. Scott saw their selection method and smiled, no need to make the choices according to their looks. They all weigh the same. They were provided by the headquarters and they are never made mistakes in their portions. Mason, Zach and Shem smiled shyly. What are those? At this point, Scott noticed gunpowder tubes at Dudien's waist. Little stuff, not worth mentioning, said Dudien, it will not bother me. Scott nodded and no longer said anything. He looked towards distant 20 consortium scavengers and said, come over and prepare for departure. Consortia's scavengers were adults. Some of them older than Scott. However, when Scots were convened all of them gathered as one. They were supported by the consortium so they had all the equipment and weapons that Dudien's group had. Scott boss, where are we going today, A slim young man asked. Number 8. Scott turned to Mia and said, we should start as soon as possible, right? Mia nodded slightly. Scott began to walk in front while Dudien followed after him. The place where we are going today has been completely emptied and cleaned of dangers. So you shouldn't be worried about anything for now and try to save your stamina. Hearing this, Dudien and others were relieved. Their tight muscles gradually loosened down and they began to look around the surroundings. It was wasteland in the vicinity. Previously Dudien noted that the moss had covered the rear of the giant wall, which was totally opposite to the desert terrain on the other side. Outside of the giant wall is totally different in comparison to my imagination. I thought desert will be everywhere. Mason, who was walking behind Dudien, spoke out. Zack smiled and said, at least we shouldn't worry about the water problem. As long as we dig a pit, then we could get water. In front of Scott heard his words, glanced back at him, said, there are puddles on the ground, you do not have to dig pit. Even if you dig out, I'm afraid you wouldn't be able to drink. Ah. Zack was stunned. Dudien explained to him, the radiation level outside is way too high. We can't drink the water even if it was filtered by the soil. If you want to drink, you would at least have to dig tens of meters below so that it would be suitable for the human body. Right now we have enough strength to dig that deep without being worried about our stamina. So do not mix this environment with the one back from training days. Zack, who had heard Dudien's words, was puzzled. Scott looked back at Dudien, did not say anything, and continued to lead the way in front. It didn't take 10 miles when they came to a place where vegetation was unsubstantial. To be exact, they had come out to ruins. Dudien was perplexed as he saw the ruins. This was actually a broken city. There was a cracked asphalt street in front of him. There were moss and lush vegetation covering the roadside and coming out of the cracks. Broken and dilapidated concrete walls left from the buildings could be seen. It seemed they were remnants of 2 or 3 floor shops. Vines and moss had covered all of them. Over the years they had been covered and buried under dense growing plants. There were broken and scant clothing in these desolate streets. Obviously, over the time of 300 years, rain dropped over and dust enveloped them. They had turned to black and hard stone-like objects. Only the rough outline of their shapes was left. Dudien was shocked. This was the appearance of an entire ruined city. Are these the results of the outbreak of the disaster that Earth faced 300 years ago? Once humanity was prospering, civilization had expanded all over the world. Only the shell body of the original civilization was left. His chest hurt and his breath became ragged. There was moist in his eyes. Dean. Mason saw Dudien suddenly stop, couldn't help but pat his shoulder. Dudien recovered and saw Scott and Mia had already walking in the streets. He walked a bit fast to catch up with them. When his feet touched the vegetation which covered the asphalt streets, all sorts of feeling arose in his heart. He thought of his parents and sister. Flame-like explosions and their aftermath were passing in front of his eyes bit by bit. He was sad that everyone had died. Also, they will never be able to come back. This was the reality, just as the ruins that he saw in front. This is area number 9. It had been thoroughly scavenged. Scott saw. The people behind him did not keep up with his pace, so he beckoned, speed up, we are tight with time. We shouldn't waste it in here. Dudien kept his head down. Along the way, Dudien saw that the streets had been scavenged very clean. Basically, in addition to collapsed concrete walls, there was nothing left, no residual items. The streets were spacious back in time, there should be many scrapped cars, but there is nothing to see. As Scott said, everything that was left had been taken back. But if the technological products of the old were picked up, then why the giant wall's technology is so backward? Was there a serious corrosion because of nuclear radiation that no valuable object of research was picked? He followed behind Scott and Mia, as if a ghost, looking at this once familiar world but only silent. Chapter 43. The Dark King, Chapter 43. Monster. Was there anyone living in here? Mason and the others who were looking all over the streets could see the ruins covered by the vegetation. The architectural style was totally different, but from these vestiges they could vaguely understand that most of the things were the remnants of broken residential buildings. Of course. Scott looked up at the surrounding ruins and continued, our ancestors had lived in this place until the disaster destroyed it. As a result, it is desolate now. As everything that is here was made and built by our ancestors, our role is to take back these things to the consortium. Where our ancestors lived, Mason exclaimed in excitement as he heard words Scott said. Everyone was curiously looking around. Dudien saw a map drawn on sheepskin in Scott's hands. He peeked at it and saw the crooked routes sketched on it. In the center of the map a huge square pattern was depicted. The giant wall of Silva was written close to it. Outside the giant wall there were outlines of irregular curved circles marked with numbers above them. 0, 1, Dudien's eyes sweep over them. He saw that these numbers were repeated in different places. There was 0 area at one place and in another 1. The numbers went up to 7. Each area were dyed in a different color. The map looked like a rainbow. Scott saw that Dudien was observing the map. This is the scavenging map of the giant wall. The outside areas are divided by consortia in advances and marked accordingly by number and color. For example, our Melon Consortium's areas are colored in blood red. The green and yellow that you see close by to our area belongs to others. Green area's area owned by military, while yellow refers to Huazheng Consortia's area. Each consortia sends their hunters in advance to clean out the region before sending scavengers. Dudien nodded slightly as he understood the meaning behind circles and colors. 0 to 7 referred to military and 7 consortiums. He asked, "What is the gray area outside?" "This is place that hunters haven't gone through yet." Scott spoke in a serious tone. "We absolutely cannot enter these gray areas. They are extremely dangerous. Even hunters are likely to die in there if they are alone." "Dangerous?" Dudien was curious, said, "What is the source of danger?" "Monster," Scott whispered. Dudien's heart jumped. Monster. At this time, they came up a corner. There was a traffic light which had collapsed onto the street. As everything else, it was covered by vegetation and surrounded by vines. It was not collected by scavengers. "The area number 8 is in front of us." Scott looked at the corner of the street. There was less vegetation in here in comparison to other areas as it was close to the city center. Traces of cracks were one streets that had been caused by the earthquakes. From now on all of us should be on alert. Scott looked dignified as he pulled out a dagger from his waist. "The hunters have just cleaned out area number 8. We are the second batch to enter this region. Although the harvest will be very good, but it is likely that we will encounter monsters that weren't killed by hunters. Be calm and try not to be attacked by monsters, otherwise you may get infected." Dudien and the others who were new to this felt a little nervous. They took out their weapons as Scott had done previously. Everyone vigilantly began to scan the surrounding environment. As Scott entered the middle of the street, Dudien saw a new wooden sign on the roadside. There was a blood-red 8 written on it, representing the area number 8 under Melon Foundation. Dudien vaguely saw a large lump of green vegetation covering an object on another part of the street far away from them. From the shape of object he identified it as a scrapped car. He was excited at sight. If there were cars, then he could find generators too. Naturally, in the last 300 years, because of the ultraviolet effects, rain, and corrosion, most of them would have turned into scrap metal. But there was a chance that he would find some well-preserved parts. There can be a well-preserved generator at some underground shelter too. Scott whispered, "These green vegetation are covering some large-scale materials. When we return we have to think of way to take them back. For now the first is to find a foothold to live for the next 10 days. So we should get a base camp and the separate to search for the materials." They passed by the cars that were covered by the greenery. They were totally unaware of a pale and dry hand that stretched out of the windows of one of the cars that was covered in thick vegetation. It was struggling to catch the crowd that had gone. At the end of the street on Crossroads, Scoot looked up and picked a slightly complete 3-story building. "This place should be fine. Let's clean up the place." He went towards the building. "Ah!" A girl's scream sounded out from behind. She pointed out to the ground close to the building in horror. "Blood! Blood!" She was shocked and trembling. Everyone looked to see a pool of blood on the ground. Although it had dried up, but the color was visible. It was clearly left in here recently. After all, rain would have scrubbed it away in the last 3 centuries. Dudiens remembered Scott's words regarding the monster. He subconsciously clutched his waist where gunpowder was kept. Other children were tensed up as they saw the blood pool on the ground. Scott frowned. "What are you making the fuss for? I've already said that there were monsters in here. Obviously hunters have killed them. Do you expect them to clean afterwards? Do not be surprised, as we may see sights like this a lot." "Ah. I hate working with rookies." His patience was clearly not as high towards other as with Dudien. Mia, who was next to him, pushed forward the door of the building. The door was made up of the glass but had been broken. It seemed to be a shop. Vegetation had spread inside the building. Dudien entered behind Scott. There was thick accumulation of dust everywhere. After the long time, it had dried and had become as hard as the layer of earth. Scott with the handle of the dagger poked the vegetation on the counter. There was a glass cabinet. His eyes brightened. Immediately with the hilt of the dagger he broke the glass and grabbed the jewelry that was inside. He wiped the dust above the jewelry with a fabric and exposed the golden luster. There was surprise exposed on his face. Dudien quietly watched. He knew that Scott will get extra commission from the jewelry that he had picked up. After all, nobles love gold. Especially the ornaments such as these were very hard to find. Chapter 44. The Dark King, Chapter 44. Corpse. It is gold. Macon and Zack also noted the jewelry in the counter. Their faces showed a bit of excitement. Scott heard excited shouts. There was a faint smile on his face as he turned back and said, "I would like to remind you all that although we are a group, but the person who picks up the materials keeps it. This is the rule and all the consortiums are very clear about this point. I'm not deliberately bullying you." Then he pointed towards the 20 scavengers from the consortium. Mason, who heard this, had an ugly look on his face. A slim youth from the group consortium scavengers nodded in affirmation of Scott's words. He is right. Do not be lazy, as whoever picks up the materials owns it. The one who is capable and have luck on his side will pick up more than others. Mason was frustrated as he heard them talk. Scott was the first to find the gold jewelry, so it is naturally his. Unfortunately, they won't be getting any commission or royalty. Dudien was disappointed with the rule too. But soon their spirits rose. In fact, for newcomers like them it was a fair rule. In sense it protected them too, at least they wouldn't share their findings with others. In this case, Scott's luck was good. As he randomly selected a foothold which happened to be gold shop. Scott cracked all the glass containers in the room and took out all the jewelry. He piled them in one of the cupboards and again clenched his dagger. All right, we should clean up this place. Dudien and others began to clean the dirt in the room. Scott added, do not attempt to steal or use other dirty ways to seize the other's loot. If the owner of the materials is killed in the process of scavenging, then the materials that he had picked will belong to the consortia and will not be shared. Dudien knew that Scott was telling the newcomers not to be greedy and use crooked methods to acquire materials. He also secretly appreciated the consortium to set such a rule. To a large extent, a rule like this would make scavengers to avoid killing each other in the wilderness. Scott and Mia took the lead and walked up the stairs as they finished cleaning the first floor. The corridor was covered in corrugated thick vegetation. There were few things scattered on it. Dudiens recognized them at a glance. It was a woman's shoes and a wallet. It seems riots had occurred while the disaster outbreak. Consortium scavengers followed after them, but a middle-aged one collapsed down because of stampede in the stairs. Ha fell onto the ground. Fortunately it was first floor and his body was blessed by God, so he was not injured. But newcomers were scared the shit out of them because of this sudden occurrence. Scott looked back and frowned. It is extremely dark on the second floor. The windows have long been covered by the vegetation, so there is not ventilated and sun cannot penetrate inside. As a result, the ground is a bit wet. Be careful when walking. Scott lit a torch. He carried the torch to walk in front. The corridor was dimly illuminated by the burning torch. He stood before the first room in the corridor. The door of the room was half covered. Scott gently pushed the door. Suddenly an air was blown outwards that almost extinguished the torch. Scott had a dagger on his right hand while he lowered the torch a little with his left hand. He slowly entered the room. The floor was cluttered. The chair was knocked onto the ground, the curtain was torn in half, the windows were broken and dense vegetation covered everywhere. Kacha! From the depth of the room came a slight sound. Scott's face changed and immediately lifted the torch according to his instincts. Dudien saw that it was a bathroom. The curtain had collapsed onto the ground. Two pale withered thighs were hanging out of the bath tube. As the torch's shine illuminated the surround, they saw the thigh's owner. It was Rotten Woman's face which was pointing to them. The sound came from her chest. On top of her tummy there was a huge black rat that was constantly kicking onto Woman's chest. Dudiens could observe the scene from the gap of Scott's arm. His pupils suddenly tightened. Its size was as big as a hound. Its hair was colored black and its tail was as thick as a finger. It was eating the woman's body. Is the monster? Scott was the first to react, by throwing the small dagger at it. The rat that was feeding on woman got aware of the fire behind it. It turned its head towards the fire. Its eyes were blood red, full of violence. Its sharp mouth was stained with stick blood. Few very long hairs which seemed to be its beard was fluttering slightly. As if knowing that it would be outnumbered by the enemy, it suddenly stepped on the side of tube and jumped outside through the windows. Scott and Mia's attacks all come to nothing. Everyone was focused on extraordinary rat's movement as they heard Scott's words. Scott whispered, "It run away." Then he leveled the torch down according to dead woman's head. It was as if she was staring at him with her pale green eyes. Good God, Mason covered his nose because of the rancid smell. Dudien had forgotten about breathing. His heart was in shock as it was no trivial matter. In the last 300 years of the nuclear radiation, the rats which had lived in here from generation to generation had gone through a terrible gene mutation. His eyes fell on the woman. The other one was naked. Her chest was carved out by the rat. Half of her heart was bitten. However, his eyes fell on her eyebrows. There was a finger-thick blood hole, which seemed to be a bullet chute. Dudien was startled but then rejected the possibility of the bullet. Rather more likely it was an arrow that had caused the damage. After all, there was no significant tearing or destruction which had to be caused by the power of bullet. But he still couldn't understand that if the woman died by an arrow shot, then a person had killed her. What kind of people will shoot her with an arrow? Dudien thought. Suddenly the hairs on his whole body stood erect. He had neglected a point while thinking through. This woman, obviously, was in the process of bathing while she was killed. However, the water supply system in this house should have long been broken. Moreover, the people in this world rarely like to wash themselves naked. So even if hunter or a scavenger, they would try to avoid taking a bath in the 10 days tasks. Was she killed 300 years ago? Did she die while taking bath? If so, her body should have rotted. Dudien was frustrated. Mia crouched down and picked the curtain to cover dead woman's body. Even it was wilderness, Mia didn't want woman's body to be kept exposed. However, when Mia raised the curtain to cover her, Dudien inadvertently saw the woman's arm. There were sharp claws. Instead of nails there were sharp, long, thorny claws. 5 spikes slightly bent. It was difficult to imagine being gripped by such a palm. What kind of harm it would cause? Mutated humans? Dudien stared speechless, his mind confused. Chapter 45. The Dark King, Chapter 45. Undead. Undead's corpse. Scott muttered. He saw Mia carefully cover her face with a trace of loss, sighed, "Clean up the room. This thing must be burned, otherwise it will be a source to nurture the other monsters." Mia's mouth was fretting. She silently got up, looked at this woman's rotten face and turned around to clean up the room of other available materials. Dudien heard Scott's words. His heart was startled. He couldn't help but ask, "What is undead?" Scott looked at Mia's back and saw her silently picking up the materials on the ground and table. He sighed and replied to Dudien, "Undeads are a type of monster which are extremely powerful and similar to human being. They like the taste of the blood, so they will hunt and eat any living being which they detect. They suck the life out of body by eating the flesh and drinking the blood. As more they feed on animals and humans, more powerful they will get." "How did they come about?" asked Dudien. Scott sighed. "They were infected by the devil. Before death these undead were human beings. Unfortunately they could not withstand the temptation of power offered by the devil and eventually abandoned their soul for it. Although they gain eternal life and unlimited power, but they lose their personality and memories. In short, they turn to devil's minions." Infected. Dudien naturally didn't believe in the devil story, so he asked more, "Is the infection result of the radiation?" Scott did not think that Dudien would want to go to the bottom of the hole for the answers. He looked at him and shook his head. "Of course not. Radiation damages the body, distorting its shape. But they will never become such bloodthirsty monsters. However, in this case, it's the devil that agitates them by exchanging their soul for power. Moreover, it is like a plague disease which can be transferred to other if they bite someone off. It's like the previous bone rat, which was a low-level monster that could infect others by biting. Mutual infection, huh? Isn't this a virus? However, where the virus was originated. Could it be 300 years ago, after he went into frozen storage capsule other things had happened? Scott sighed and said, these bone rats like hiding in the darkness. Hunters would normally ignore them. Although with our power we can kill them, but you all should be careful not to be bitten by them. In case your skin is scratched, then you will turn into an undead. He looked at Mia, who was silently picking up materials, and said, Mia's husband was bitten on the arm by a rat monster. The metal object in Mia's hand suddenly fell onto the ground. Scott was startled. He didn't say anything anymore to Dudien. He changed the topic, we should separately clean the rooms. Remember to be careful. These monsters can smell our body's odor and blood. Although the bone rat ran away, but it still is hovering in the vicinity. Be carefully as they hide in the darkness. So check corners and dark places before going in. The best is team up into groups of 4 so that you can take of each other in case of emergency. He was mainly talking to new scavengers. Those consortium scavengers were not as good as the regular scavengers, but they had rich experience. Hearing Scott's instructions, the people began to scatter away. Mason, Zach, Sham, and others were shocked by the terrible appearance of the undead. Moreover, the previous bone rat's huge body had made their minds uneasy. They had never seen such bloody and dangerous scenes. Most of them had forgotten their studies in the training camp and at the moment just wanted to hold together close to Scott. Scott looked at these children's pale faces, which was the result of shock. He slightly frowned. Haveni, your instructors told you that being a scavenger is not a simple job. If you continue to follow me, you will lose your chance to pick up anything valuable. By the way, there is a quota set by the consortia. If your scavenging results are lower than that for several times, you will be expelled from the consortium. Expulsion. Mason, Sham, Zach, and other turned paler. They fought back the fear in their hearts, clenched their weapons and turned to leave. Dudien was about to turn away when Scott called out, you do not have to follow them, just follow me. This time, I will give you 1/3 of everything that I will pick. However, the next time you will be on your own. I'd like to go alone. If there's something wrong, I'd call for help, Dudien frowned. Scott looked at him in surprise and said, well then, be careful. Dudien nodded slightly and turned towards Mason and the other 2, let's go. Mason secretly gave him the thumbs up and left the room with them. Dudien saw that all the rooms in the second floor had already been occupied by small teams to be searched, so he said, we are going to go to 3rd floor. Mason and the other 2 didn't object. They had come to unconditional decision that Dudien's decision would be final say at all times. The 3rd floor was also the top floor. Vegetation was sparse. Gray cloudy shadows shone in from the broken windows. The floor was piled with a thick layer of dust while blood was scattered on the walls and the corridor. There were corpses along the corridor. Some were cut at different parts of the body while the others had their heads crushed. There were traces of blade scars on the walls. The hunters had been here and a vicious battle has taken place. Dudien noticed that all the corpses had sharp claws instead of fingernails. Although he didn't know where the virus originated from, but there is no doubt that to have such amazing effects it had to be created at world's top biological institute. Maybe, not, most likely it was made by those guys. Mason and the other 2 swallowed their saliva when they saw the bodies on the ground. During the training they had killed snakes, lizards, and other animals. They have cut them into pieces, taken out their organs and seen their blood flow out. But at the end of the day, human is human. Witness a human corpse in front of the eyes was totally different to killing an animal and dismembering it. Mason, Zach, and Shem felt a sense of fear. Their limbs went cold as if these dead bodies will suddenly get up, claim their lives. Dudien was equally afraid, but he tried to keep calm. Through illumination of the sunshine he came to the first room in the corridor. The door of the room was open, and the lock was broken. There was a violent intrusion and traces of the battle that had happened not long ago were still engraved on the walls of the room. There was a pool of blood on the ground and 2 more corpses. The dead bodies belonged to young men and women. Their complexion was unusually pale. The green veins appeared on their body and their feet were dry and lean. It was as if the body fat was drained and only the muscle tissue was left. Dudien put on his mask and spoke in a low tone through it, Do not touch the body. Look around for useful materials. High eyes swept the whole room. He saw a laptop covered in dust. Dudian cleaned the dust off the laptop. He gently pressed down the power button. Apparently the spring connecting the button had rotten and was unusable. He took it back so that later on to disassemble it to see what parts were functional. Chapter 46. The Dark King, Chapter 46. Assault. Mason, Sham and Zack were separately searching for materials in the room, but were doing their best to avoid those two dead bodies on the ground. Even though bodies had no life in them, they were still afraid of them. Mason and the other two found some metal objects from the room. They didn't know the roles of the items that they had picked. But according to their logic, any metal object must have some kind of value. Dudian saw them pick up phone, TV remote control, electric lights, and other objects. He was wondering that scavengers who find things similar to the one Mason and the other two found should be a lot. Hart cannot help but wonder, scavengers who have to find these things should be a lot. How do they evaluate the value of these things? However, when he thought deeply about the issue, he did understand that in these 300+ years the normal ecological environment has changed a lot. So in terms of radiation level, the standards which applied in those days aren't same as the ones in present times and world. Still, there was the question of the value and purpose of the objects which are acquired. Even there are parts that aren't harmed in one or another way and they are accumulated in the hands of the consortiums, then how do they value things if they don't know the original use of the part? For an object to resist the nuclear radiation, it had to be made up of lead, gold, or other high-density metal, which was why the gold jewelry under the counter was kept as it. Go to the next room. Dudian glanced around and saw that there was nothing of value. They were the first to come over the area, so Dudian wanted for his group to pick the objects of high value. In the future, when other raiders will come to scavenge, they would be able to pick clothing, beds, refrigerators, or other large objects that would be left for metal to be removed. Mason and the other two didn't want to stay in the room for long, so they immediately left out. There were corpses lying on the corridor. It was especially quiet. Dudian looked at a few corpses, feeling that they will suddenly wake up. He suppressed the cranky feeling and opened the door of the second room. He was thinking about the nuclear disaster while he was searching the room. Apparently 300 years ago, when the global nuclear bombing broke out, it was not the only disaster. A terrible virus had begun to infect the survivors. This unknown virus had turned people who were infected into undeads. So for people to survive in highly dangerous zones, it had to understood how terrible and tenacious the virus is. Dudian was mainly looking for computers, mobile phone, and appliances similar to those. After all, in residential rooms those were the things of value. There was a desktop computer in the second room. Dudian wasn't planning to take the whole machine with himself. He opened it up and took the electric box that was inside. The wires were covered in dust. He touched the main board, but it was like a thin layer of paper. After the long-term radiation, it had completely deteriorated. Dudian sighed. Resistors that were on the motherboard were either dried down or swollen into strange shapes. Dudian slightly shook his head and gave up on the machine. After all, this was the first day and there were another 9 days to go. He could pick lots of things in the next 9 days, but he couldn't carry them all as there were limits to much he could handle. If there was a truck, I wonder how much I could carry out. An idea emerged in his mind. But he soon was discouraged as the computer in front of him had turned into a useless garbage. How would he find proper parts to make a car as everything has deformed into irreparable state? He would need the help of supercomputer. The premise was to have electricity. Later on he found a generator, to be precise a wind generator, which needed an open field to work. Even if he went to slums to buy such a site, he still lacked the funds to do so. They went through third and fourth rooms. The building was completely plundered in less than half an hour. Everyone had stacked their goods on the first floor's hall. They registered their findings with Scott to prevent confusion and theft in the future. Clearly, in the long history of the scavengers, they had understood that in order to obtain the best interests for participants, the civil strife had to be eliminated. Now, everyone should go to search the nearby bar. Scott said to Crows as he finished registering the products. 20 consortium scavengers who were eager for more didn't wait for long and formed groups of 4 or 5 and left the shop to nearby ruins in search of supplies. Scott looked at Dudian, said, "I and Mia will be searching for supplies together." Do you want to go with us? Dudien shook his head. No, I'll go with my friends. Don't forget that in case of danger call for help. It's very quiet in here, so as long as the distance is not too far then we will hear. Scott didn't insist for Dudien to join them but reminded him being very dangerous situations. Dudien nodded and turned to call Mason, Zach and Shem 3. They went down the street towards a dilapidated building that was in the vicinity. Dudien didn't go into every building as he could know that what he could find in those ruins. Soon he found ruin of a small supermarket. The supermarket was covered by vegetation, but because of its style it still could be identified as a supermarket. He didn't know what kind of disaster had it suffered as it had collapsed from middle down to door. In front of it there were few corpses which seemed to be killed recently. So many corpses, Mason spoke out. Their faces had turned ugly after they had come to area number 8. There were dead bodies everywhere. They couldn't imagine what kind of a picture those hunters faced when they had come here first. Dudien's mind was also timid, but still maintained his calm. He passed by the corpses and went towards an entrance to the supermarket. He stepped inside but he saw dead corpses in that instant. There were 8 red spots which emitted low sounds. Monsters. Dudien's pupils shrank as hurried back. A gray shadow flashed by the entrance and jumped towards Dudien while he was retreating. Chapter 47. The Dark King, Chapter 47. The First Battle. Dudien quickly fell sideways and rolled to escape the gray shadow's attack. He looked up to a dark-haired rat. It was similar to Bone Rat, which he had seen previously, but it was a little thinner and small. At the moment its blood-red eyes were tightly staring at him while it exposed its hideous teeth. Monster. May, Zach and Shem cried out loud. Their face turned white while their legs became soft. The mutated rat jumped again towards the nearest Dudien as soon as it landed. Dudien's hairs were erect. The rat was too fast and he was too late to dodge it. His reaction was slow and instinctively he raised his arm to resist. Bang. He felt a heavy impact that hit his upper body. Because of imbalance he fell backwards. He was scared so he had closed his eyes when he had raised his arm. The rat's small teeth tightly bite his arm. His palm loosened and the dagger fell onto ground. Because of fear and adrenaline, blood rushed into his mind instantly. Help me! Help me! Many ideas flooded his mind which confused him. His instincts had taken over the reason when he had faced an encounter which impacted his life. The rat wasn't able to bite through the uniform so it began to chew his arm non-stop. A sharp pain came from his arm. Dudien quickly calmed his mind and put to panicky senses at the back of his mind. Everything happened in a time of few breaths. Dudien roared, picked up his arm and severely hit the ground. He grabbed the leg of the rat using his other arm. He kept hitting the ground using his right arm, so that rat's head would be hurt while violently colliding with the ground. Bang. 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 Because of continuous violent crashes and pulling of its leg, the rat didn't stick up till the end but loosened its mouth. Dudien roared and hit its body to the ground while keeping a firm hang on rat's leg. Die. He crazily hit the rat again and again while whirling it around. Dudien roared a crazy hit, again and again to whirl hit the ground. The rat's head bone cracked because of hard collision and blood spilled out. Vicinity was filled with blood. He didn't know how many times he had hit the rat as Dudien's anger gradually subsided. Tiredness spread all over his arm. He picked up the dagger from the ground and mercilessly stabbed into rat's stomach. Dagger was extremely sharp and it continuously thorned through rat's skin. The dagger was stained in blood. Dudien stopped his attack as he saw rat stop movement. His heart was still thumping fast. There was fear still lingering in his heart as he recalled the previous scene. This was his first time facing a life-death situation. Although he had outlived the nuclear disaster but was like watching a disaster movie through a TV. Experiencing firsthand a threat like this was totally different. Even without a mirror, he could feel that his face at the moment would look extremely ugly. He looked at his right arm. Above the uniform there were few deep dent marks. Fortunately this black, soft material was made of extremely hard substances and had a layer of lead. Otherwise, as Scott had mentioned before, because of the rate of the infection he would have turned into an undead like Mia's late husband. Dean. Mason cried out in vain. Dudien looked up at him. Suddenly Mason rushed out and raised his dagger and cut above his head. Dudien suddenly woke up from euphoria and thought of the previous 8 red spots that he saw in the supermarket. Poochie! Mason's dagger had torn a rat and blood was sputtering out. Dudien quickly looked back and saw that in addition to the rat that was stabbed by Mason, another 3 rats had rushed out from the broken glasses of supermarket. They stared at Dudien and Mason with blood-red eyes for a moment. They rapidly jumped towards Mason and Dudien as if they were agile cheetahs. Dudien's face ugly as he waved the dagger again and again to intimidate these rats. However, simple intimidation did not scare them. One of them suddenly jumped to Dudien's front. Dudien quickly stabbed his dagger, but the blade cut rat's greasy hair. Its outer body was so hard that it wasn't affected by dagger. Instead, T fall down, jumped again, and grabbed onto Dudien's chest. 2 of its front claws tried to grasp Dudien's face. As a beast, it instinctively knew the vital parts of its prey. Dudien quickly grabbed its hair. Because of the armored gloves, he wasn't worried about the infection that could contaminate him. However, the rat's hair was extremely hairy. As hard as Dudien tried, he could still feel the hair in his hands to rapidly slide away. Once again he was facing a desperate situation. Suddenly, Dudien roared. His feet straddled and body turned in a very soft posture. He had stood up without using his hands. At the same time, his arm clutched at the last trace of the rat's hair and pushed it aside. Rat flied out. The rat fall down one ground, made few circles and stopped on to attack once more. Dudien's heart was contracted, muscle tensed, and his mental force was at its highest degree of concentration at the moment. He suddenly kicked. Bang! Dudien's feet had kicked the rat as if he has expected the attack route of the rat and actually kicked it in the exact position of its flutter. His kick contained the power of his anger and despair. It was a heavy blow which made the rat to fly out, then hit and roll on the ground. The rat was screaming in sharp tone. Dudien did not stop, instead took the initiative and rushed out. He went ahead and used the dagger to stab it while the rat has not climbed up. The dagger tore its abdomen, penetrating it deeply. The rat fiercely struggled, uttering pierce-sharp cries. Dudien's body strength was exhausted, but he firmly nailed the rat onto ground. He was not releasing it despite its struggles and screams. His heart was full of hostility. Chapter 48. The Dark King, Chapter 48. Death. Ah! Screams echoed out. Dudien looked back to see that Mason was outflanked by 2 rats and threw himself onto ground. Zack and Shem approached in haste to kick the rats. They didn't attack with daggers, worried that they would injure Mason. Dudien's face changed. He quickly pulled out the dagger and reflexively rushed past. Go away! Dudien roared loudly. His metal boots kicked one of the rats' head. With a bang sound, the rat fall back. Zack used the opportunity to rush up and to kick its head severely. Shem grabbed the tail of the other mouse so that it didn't climb onto Mason's face. Dudien's body had adapted to fighting against the rats because of the experience. He pulled from rat's hind leg and fiercely hit it on the ground. After a few violent hits, its sharp little head was knocked on ground and its struggle became weak. Dudien continuously whirlwindingly hit the rat onto ground. The rat couldn't find a leverage to break out of his hand. After 10 consecutive times of hit, the rat gradually stopped moving. Its body twitched a few times as blood penetrated out from its hair, coloring the ground red. Mason and Zack had killed the other rat. Dudien looked at the rat. He used the dagger to stop it few more times. He was relieved and sat on the ground. His whole body was exhausted. He felt like his arm was non-existent because of the pain. He was taking big breaths using his mouth. However, the mask's air filter was very slow, so felt dizzy and hypoxic. Mason also sat next to him, his back against Dudien's. Zack and Sham's state were much better, as they still retained a lot of physical power and stamina. They looked at the ground. The dead bodies of rats were still laying on the ground. They were frightened by the sight. After a while of rest, Mason threw his hair backwards. He was panting as he talked. Damn! It almost got my throat. These damn things. Dudien's breathing has gradually got smooth, looked back at him, said, thanks to you, I'm. Mason snapped, what the heck, man? Dudien smiled, no longer say anything. Zack had a lingering fear, there are so many damned rats around that hunters haven't even touched. How the heck do they call this place clean? Shem congratulated. Fortunately, the uniforms are tough enough to bites of these rats. If they were torn, the consequences would be unthinkable. Dudian looked at the corpses of rats that were in front of him and thought back to their previous battle. His fingers clenched into a fist. Too bad. His performance was too bad. If not because of Mason's timely intervention, he would have been bitten by the rat that attacked in from rear. You have done very well. After all, it was the first time you encountered such a fight. Even adults will be scared and panicked if a dog attacked them out of nowhere. A voice inside of him relieved himself while he was self-blaming himself. Dudian strangled the voice within him, biting his lips and making the pain hit his mind. He let his weakness remember that you live only once. In the face of death, almost everything is meaningless. To save yourself, you gotta have the power. Only by being powerful he could survive. He suddenly understood why the scavengers are selected only from the residential areas and slums rather than the people who attend the college selection from the commercial district. Because the mortality rate of the job is too high. Although they encountered danger, it was trivial because area number 8 has been cleaned by the hunters in advance. If the scavengers would be collecting in areas number 9 or number 10, the probability of encountering these monsters will be very low. However, low risk also meant that there will be low harvest. This is a dangerous job. But it was worth it in terms of returns. It was fair. Because of the previous combat experience, there was fear of death in Dudian's mind. This time they encountered mutated rats. Would they encounter more terrible monsters the next time? Should they join into a larger force so that their chances to survive increases? He looked at the broken glass door of the supermarket. There was a feeling subconsciously forcing him to retreat. Soon, he thought of his right arm. He thought of the marks engraved on it. A sudden firmness was reflected on his eyes. Propping the ground, he said to the 3, "Let's go in. Most of them are dead now, so there should be a few inside. Perhaps hiding in the dark. We should be careful of them." Mason, Zach, and Shem were surprised as they did not expect Dudian to dare to enter the ruins of this building. They saw the determination in his eyes. They slightly hesitated, then stood up, clenched their dagger and were ready to enter. At this time, "Ah!" Scream echoed out from the nearby street. It was quit in these rotten ruins, so the sound was especially loud for the environment. Dudian and the other 3 were surprised for a moment. He thought of the battle that they had just experienced with the rat monsters. As he heard the shrill cry, he thought that the others also encountered something for the first time. He hesitated as he did not know if he should go for help. Dudian hesitated for a while as his mind came up with few ideas. He said in a cold tone, "Let's check it out. If the odds are against us, we should withdraw." Mason and the other 2 were hesitant as they heard him talk. They nodded. They ran along the direction of Scream. There were scavengers who came out from other buildings who had ran to the place where screams were echoing out. Soon, the screams got more noisy and intense as they came up the street corner. Dudian immediately slowed down and made a slight hand gesture. Mason, Shem, and Zach understood and slowed down their pace. They walked slowly behind Dudian. Around the corner, Dudian moved his head out to probe out the situation. Suddenly his pupils shrank and face turned ugly in horror. Center of the street was full of green vegetation. In front of a broken shop, 2 people were twisting on the ground. A man and a woman. However, the figure on top had torn coat, revealing white skin. Instead of fingers there were sharp claws. It was an undead. Alive, undead. This woman undead was on top of the struggling youth. Dudian could clearly see the woman biting and tearing the flesh out of youth's chest. Blood vessel tissues were hanging like the wires from woman's mouth. Blood was constantly spewing out of the youth's chest. By the youth's feet there was another body of woman who lay there motionless. Seems to have already been killed. Around 10 meters away from the youth there was another young man standing. He was step by step going backwards, his hands clutching his mouth. It seemed that he was afraid to call out because of the fear. Chapter 49. The Dark King, Chapter 49. Fatal. "Ah, Aaron, save me." At this time, the youth that was being bitten by the undead cried out. His hand was raised as if to reach out to the young man who was retreating backwards in hurry. His handsome face was full of fear and pain. Moreover, there was a desire to live. The young man, Aaron, clutching his mouth, looked down at his close friend. His body was trembling and tears were streaming down his face. He gritted his teeth and turned to run towards the exit of the street. Dudien saw that the undead who was feeding on the youth was alerted by the footsteps of the Aaron. It raised its head towards the source of the sound. Suddenly, it stopped feeding and turned to chase after the Aaron. Its arms were fluttering, body was swinging as if it was drunk and could fall at any moment. However, its speed was extremely fast and it quickly caught up with Aaron. Aaron heard to the sounds of the movement coming from behind. He turned to look and was horrified as the undead was almost catching up with him. He turned back immediately and took out his dagger. The woman diagonally waved her arm and used her sharp claws to attack Aaron. He lifted his dagger to parry against the claw. He was able to block it but was hit to the ground by the heavy force behind the claw attack of the undead. Dudiens was extremely shocked by the sight. At the same time he was frightened to death. If the undead had attacked him in his current condition, he would absolutely die. He was lucky that he hadn't chosen this street, or at the moment he and the other three would have met their end. As he saw that the youth was gradually overwhelmed by the undead, the idea of withdrawal was sprouted in his mind. At the moment, the idea to go forward to help out the other scavengers has been left behind in deep parts of his mind. These consortium scavengers have not gone through formal training but had participated in many scavenging expeditions. As a result, they had rich experience and got more God's blessings than the newly graduated ones. So their strength should be several times greater than his. If the old-timers couldn't deal with the undead, then he was sure to die. Dudien waved back gently, gesturing to back away. Macon, who stood behind the Dudien, although did not see scene but heard the mournful screams and chewing sounds. After all, the ruins are too quiet and the sound transmission is particularly clear. As he saw Dudien's gesture, he face changed. He recalled the earlier attack by the rats and slowly went backwards. It didn't take long before another 4 consortium scavengers came out of the other side of the street. They heard the screams that were echoing out. They quickly rushed out and saw the appalling scene where Aaron's arm was bitten by the woman undead. Uniform, which was normally used as an armor, had no resistance against the sharp bites of the undead. The blood gushing out as she bit more and more. Kill it. The newcomer youth's pupil shrank in horror, but he did not go back but roared loudly, kill it. Then he said to the 3 fellow companions who were besides him, we should contain it until Scott and the others come over. His companions were also horrified. However, as soon as they heard the youth's commands, they didn't hesitate but headed towards the woman undead in rush. The dead woman heard the sound, looked up at them. As previously, she stood up in a weird twisted pose. There were no regular patterns to how she waved her arms. She rushed towards the 4 youth who had come. The youth roared loudly, and as he was running he jumped to kick the undead. He mercilessly kicked the undead woman and flung her out. She fell onto the ground. Dudien saw the 4 of them had appeared, so he was no longer in a hurry to leave. Instead, he continued to observe the scene. His heart was in joy as the youth's kick had affected the undead. However, he didn't rush out to help them as he was scared by the undead agility which he had observed before. Mason and the other 2 probed over the sideline to see the fight and taken aghast. As the youth kicked the undead, the other 3 scavengers immediately stepped forward to hold the Aaron. He was pulled back and left the battlefield. The undead's body quickly rose up, made a hoarse roar and menacingly rushed forward to the youth. The youth was taken back by the mobility of the undead. He used his dagger to cut off the undead. It sliced its arm. But there was no blood that oozed out of its skin. From the cut it could be seen that it was black flesh inside and the blood seemed to be solidified. This had resulted in its body to be extremely hard to be cut. The dagger itself was stuck into the bone. The youth's pupils shrank. Holding the hilt, he tried his best to pull it out. But he couldn't, and in this short moment the undead woman moved onto him, raised the other arms and attacked his throat. The claw clasped, making a pop sound. It had pierced through the arteries on his neck. Blood spewed out, spilling on undead's arm. Wagner. 3 who were dragging Aaron's body back, saw the scene, cried out in alarm and run back to help him. Wagner was clutching his neck while his eyes were wide open in shock. He would have never thought that his young life would end in here. He struggled to raise his head to look at the horrifying face of the undead. The light in his eyes gradually dimmed down. The undead growled and seized his body. It bit on his neck and began to eat his body. Monster. One of the companions, who was a bit chunkier than the rest, cried out loud as he rushed over. Holding his dagger, he rushed over to the corpse of the undead. The undead pushed the body of the handsome Wagner away and swayed towards the oncoming chunky youth. "Peas, no, don't go," the two group mates shouted out. His eyes were blood red. As he was reaching the undead, he took out his dagger and stabbed. He had successfully pierced the chest of the undead but didn't seem to hurt it a bit. At this point, the undead attacked the pudgy scavenger. Poochie. The sharp claw pierced through his chunky scavenger's cheek. The tip of the claw pricked from the other side of his face. He felt severe pain and wanted to cry out to ease it. But the next moment he saw the ferocious face of the undead approaching his own face. Instinctively, without losing the momentum, the undead bit him on the face. "Peas." The companion that was behind cried in grid. The other one pulled him to hastily recked back. He hoped to be able to take advantage of time, as undead was eating the pudgy peas, to escape as far as possible. Dudien didn't think that the 4 consortium scavengers are not a match against an undead which was alone. The most terrible thing was that even though its chest was pierced, it was not affected the least bit. The other side is really an immortal monster. Suddenly, he thought of the dead woman in the bathroom and other corpses that he had seen while searching for materials. He thought of the common thing in all of the bodies, which were the scars on their heads. It didn't matter whether it was a sword, dagger, or arrow injury. All of them were on their heads. Is the head their fatal point? Chapter 50. The Dark King, Chapter 50. Bloodstained. Sounds of footsteps echoed out from the rear. Dudien looked back to see Scott and Mia coming over with a large number of scavengers. Scott and Mia were in front by a difference of a large distance. Their speed was alarming, as if there were humanoid cheetahs. They were hundreds of meters away. In the blink of an eye they were in front of Dudien. "What's going on?" Scott said hastily. Dudien saw them and his heart loosened a lot. "Undead," he said, pointing to the corner of the street. Scott and Mia's face changed as they saw 2 scavengers dragging Aaron, who was in coma. They also noticed Scott. Their faces suddenly were relieved as they said in hurry, "Help us. There is an undead. Please save Peas." Scott and Mia ran past and saw the undead woman eating the chunky youth. Scott immediately drew his dagger and said, "Get ready to fight. Together we will be able to kill it, otherwise it will always pursue the smell we left behind." Mia saw the Aaron who was injured and in coma. She asked in a trembling tone, "Is he injured?" One of them replied, "He was bitten. We rushed him over to help him out." Scott's facial expression changed. "Kill him immediately, otherwise we will have to face 2 undeads." Both of them heard what Scott said. They were not rookie scavengers, and they had known for a long time that if the person is bitten by the monster, it will be infected and turned into an undead. But personally killing a scavenger who was their companion for a long time, especially a one who was still alive, was hard to do. "Can't we rescue him?" The tall youth looked at Scott. "Maybe he can hold on." "Idiot," cried Scott, interrupting his words. He continued in angry tone, "If you want to die, then hold on to him. But if you want to live, then kill him right away." At this time, another young scavenger said, "The undead is coming over." Scott quickly focused on the undead woman. She gave up the prey in her hands and glanced at the newcomers with her green eyes. Taking off in a rapid pace, she attacked Scott. Very fast. Scott's mind was surprised, but he did not flinch a bit. Scott made the first move and kicked the undead woman in the abdomen. She didn't try to dodge, was hit badly and fell to the ground. Scott seized the opportunity, quickly approached her and immediately kicked her face. His steel boot was pointed at her jaw as he kicked again. "Die, you devil!" Scott growled, raising a dagger to stab the face of the undead woman. Dagger pierced the center of its face and the undead woman uttered a dry roar. Her body was severely twitching. Her body was struggling while her head was tightly nailed to the ground by Scott. It struggled for a while, then gradually stopped moving. As he saw the undead stopping movement, Scott was relieved and he pulled the dagger out slowly from its cheekbones. Dudien knew that his previous guess was true: to kill the undead, its head to be damaged. At this time, the other scavengers also rushed over to the scene. They saw the bloody scene and were disgusted by it. Scott turned around and looked over the two young people and couldn't help but shout out in anger, "Do you want to die so bad that you still haven't killed him? If he wakes up, the first to die will be you." Then he came over towards both of them and looked down at Aaron. He took a deep breath, stabbed the dagger through his throat and cut his head off. Blood was spewing out as if it was a fountain. The two youth turned pale, their legs trembling. Scott looked at them coldly while he cleaned the blood off the dagger. "This is the giant wall's law of the survival. You no more have your instructors by your side. Either adapt or die." Then he looked at the silent Mia and sighed. He ordered the other scavengers, "Light up a fire and burn these bodies. Do not let the smell of the blood lead the others towards this place." Scavengers who were newcomers as Dudien, one by one turned pale at the sight of such a real cruel scene. One of the girls was horrified. I want to go home. I do not want to scavenge. I don't want money," she finished, turned around and ran crazily. Scott angrily said, "Catch her and bring back." Two consortia scavengers went after to recover her back immediately. One of the scavengers suddenly opened his eyes widely. Trembling, he raised his hand, pointing over Scott's back and said, "Boss, they stood up." Everyone quickly looked up. Dudien saw the first youth and the other female scavenger who had been bitten at first were struggling to stand up. The female's head was fractured from the spine, so as she raised her head its head twisting right and left. However, she rapidly adapted to her new condition. "Damn." Scott looked ugly, growled, "Everyone get ready to follow me." He was the first to rush up. Mia was the first to keep up with Scott, and the other consortia scavengers hesitated for a moment, but quickly caught up to them. Some of the newcomers from the Dudien's group stared at this scene and dropped onto ground because of the fear. Dudien had previously seen Scott's skill, so he reckoned that Scott and Mia should be able to solve out the two transformed undead. He clenched his dagger and went up ahead. Mason, Sham and Zack quickly pulled him back and said, "Are you crazy? I'm going to destroy the other two bodies so that they do not turn into undead," Dodian said. The three were surprised but immediately said, "We will go as well." Four of them ran behind the consortium scavengers. They had come by the bodies of the handsome and chunky youths. Dudien looked at the dead body by his feet. He hesitated for a moment but then cut off their necks. After 2 blessings, Dudien's body had become twice stronger than an average adult, so he easily cut off their necks. Dudien's heart was pounding wildly. Although he knew that they were already dead, but the action had brought him guilt of killing people and fear. His hand, which was holding dagger, trembled. He constantly comforted himself in his heart. Suddenly he heard sudden screams that came up from the front. He saw more than a dozen consortium scavengers, including Scott and Mia, with a face full of panic, turn and flee towards them. Dudien saw more than a dozen undeads from the gap while the consortium scavengers were escaping. Part 3 of the series ends here. Thank you for watching and listening. If you find it interesting, please give us a like, a comment and a subscription so that we have the motivation to make the next videos.